I'd like to welcome you all to the last seminar of IR seminar series and one of the last seminars of the AI and CSS seminar series of GLODEM. So this event is co-hosted by two. And today we have the great pleasure of having Dr. Matthias Maas and Dr. Lena Trabucco with us. They're going to present their project titled Into the Thick of It, Mapping the Emerging Landscape of Military AI Strategic Partnerships. Before we move on to their presentation, I also would like to briefly introduce them both to you. Matthias Maas is a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. He works on adaptive global governance approaches for extreme technological risks, with a particular focus on regimes for high stakes or destabilizing military uses of AI technology. His other research interests are on the effects of AI technology on international law itself, as well as conceptual frameworks for the regulation of uncertain risks from emerging technology. Lena Trabucco is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen and a research affiliate at the Center for Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. Her research focuses on strategic and legal implications of emerging military technology with a focus on AI and quantum technologies. She holds a PhD in political science from Northwestern University and a PhD in law from the University of Copenhagen. Without further ado, the floor is yours. I'll mute myself.
Thanks so much, Mary, for the introduction. So as Mary said, my name is Lena. I'm very, very thrilled to be here to present my ongoing work with Matthias. This is very much work in progress paper, so we're looking forward to your comments and questions at the end. So let me do the classic Zoom here and share my screen with you. Okay, and are you able to see it, Mary?
Yes.
Fantastic, great. So our paper that we're going to present today, as Mary said, is entitled Into the Thick of It, Mapping the Emerging Landscape of Military, just hide your faces there, Mapping the Emerging Landscape of Military AI Strategic Partnerships. So as a starting point for this paper, we begin with the acknowledgement that the international order is in a moment of realignment, where we have seen considerable progress in a range of so-called emerging and disruptive technologies, or EDTs, which experts anticipate will reshape military institutions, challenge traditional understandings of international actors as tools, environments, and goals. As EDT innovation expands and accelerates tactical and strategic capabilities for modern militaries, the international security environment must account for these changes. And so that's where we are going to lead the discussion. But before I continue, a few disclaimers are perhaps in order. So we're going to talk a lot about AI for this paper and this project, because that's our focus, but we are strictly examining military and defense partnerships around AI here. So certainly the civil sector collaboration around AI and EDTs are vast and necessary and extensively written about, but the national security domain presents its own sets of challenges here that are not necessarily at issue in the civilian sector. So we can talk about some of those differences if you want later on. Second, the landscape of these military AI partnerships is changing rapidly. Sometimes it feels almost daily when you're doing this kind of research. It's a bit like shooting darts at a moving board, to be honest, because the political and technological and legal developments cause the landscape to shift and shift again. So despite the ongoing and inevitable changes that happen in this space, We argue in our paper that it's still necessary to begin thinking about these partnerships now in order to better understand their impacts on the technological and political development of AI and its incorporation and subsequent military practices. So it's unlikely that I'm going to take the entire time for this presentation, so I'll try to leave as much time for discussion at the end with Matthias and myself, because I would much rather hear your thoughts and questions than myself talk. So let's get started here. In order to understand emerging military AI strategic partnership, or MASPs, and feel free to comment on that acronym if you'd like, we need to better understand a few things here. We need to understand what they involve, both in terms of participants, but also substantive obligations, why they could matter to the international landscape, and what their effects may be. And similarly, we want to also try to address how these partnerships could be instrumental to the military uses of AI. So could these partnerships impact subsequent military practices? Certainly for geopolitics, this is a significant component of the discussion that we'll talk about more later, and for AI governance more broadly. So due to this shifting landscape, as I said, we're not going to have, unfortunately, very concrete answers to these issues, which is unfortunate. But we will offer some insights at the end, because I think many of the resolutions for these challenges or these issues here are just going to come with time. So here, I'm instead going to cover AI partnerships and why we think they matter, why we should study this. We'll discuss what a strategic partnership is, or more importantly, maybe what it is not, and why states would want to pursue them. And also what could be unique about technology partnerships in particular, and how military technology partnerships may be its own very unique subset here that we each want to think about. And then we're going to cover some cases. And importantly, I want to just bring this up front now, and I'll say it again later, that these cases are not exhaustive. They are just to be illustrative. So we chose these cases in order to bring variation in terms of breadth and depth of these partnerships. So we'll talk about each one in particular and have a little bit more concrete examples to work with. And then finally, we'll offer some insights and conclusions based on those cases. So to begin, technological change may spur or contribute to international realignment. So firstly, technological shocks are not fully exogenous, but can create new winners and losers, alter actor preferences, and allow the strategic construction of new norms and organizations, according to Dresner. What could this mean in the context of military AI? Well, we think that as AI, we think of AI as a new military enabler. Within the past few years, we've seen an emergence of these new forms of interstate collaborations around military AI development and use. And these efforts are both existing along lines of pre-established partnerships, such as NATO or Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, but we're also seeing them form along new lines too, bringing together non-traditional partners on defense issues. So for example, as I will discuss in much more depth later, the 2020 AI Partnership for Defense, it's led by the United States, which is a collection of like-minded countries across the globe to tackle these defense and security-related issues, to implementing AI. And these kinds of partnerships, we think, are going to be critical to how AI is ultimately implemented into the military or achieving any kind of military or security technological supremacy. But as I said, we'll talk about Partnership for Defense, or the PFD, in a bit more depth later on. So why study this? Because it's shifting so much, so why do we want to talk about this now? Well, as we all know in this audience, I'm probably sure I don't have to convince you, but there is a substantial literature on military AI, but it's predominantly focused on these things here. It's predominantly focused on AI's role in specific countries' military doctrines or strategies, like in the US and UK. General implications for international security and geopolitics. There's a very large focus on bilateral relations and strategic competition between the US and China. For regulating AI under existing principles or regimes, or shaping restrictions through multilateral regulatory instruments. I think most controversially, that's around whether to ban autonomous weapons systems with a treaty or not. So there's a lot of discussions on these topics, right? We all know that. However, there's considerable space and a considerable gap in determining how these military AI strategic partnerships will likely matter for these topics. So we think that we want to think about these strategic partnerships because they could be affecting the usage of AI systems, the operational practices around deployed AI systems, AI's problem portfolio regarding safety, security, interoperability, ethics, or instability, just as some examples, and certainly for the coherence and efficacy for any multilateral instruments or for the military AI regime. So we think that these partnerships are really relevant for addressing some of these problems that we see here in the blue, and are then in turn really relevant for those ones in red, but are currently not part of the discussion to any meaningful extent. So this is why we want to study it, but let's maybe start with what is a strategic partnership. So we begin with a definition offered by Basra and Cuddy. Strategic partnerships are not alliances. Rather, they are cooperative relationships that carry features of strategic and other forms of cooperation, but they stop short of commitments to fight on behalf of a partner. So strategic partnerships can have certain features here. They're not necessarily aimed at an identified enemy, although often there is a particular adversarial reason for these formations to come about, but it may not be as explicit as in an alliance context. They can be limited and flexible and do not necessarily have to involve deep commitments to security. They usually involve regular high-level political interactions. They frequently involve security cooperation, which could include things like arms transfers, joint military exercises, or other forms of cooperation. And they can often extend to other mutually beneficial interactions, such as economic exchanges. But we want to add a particular list or a particular feature to this list, where we argue in our paper that strategic partnerships can also exist along a spectrum of formality. So we think that they can exist formally through treaties, and they can also exist through loose forms of collaboration. And we'll see examples of both later on. But for now, it's just important to flag up front that there's this spectrum and wide room for variation in the form that these strategic partnerships can take place, so that when we're trying to identify a strategic partnership, we can recognize that it can exist at either end or somewhere along this spectrum of formality. Oh, sorry, there we go. So why do we see the rise of strategic partnerships? So there's been a historical shift away from traditional alliances and more towards these strategic partnerships because of a rise of global interdependence and multipolarity. Also, traditional alliances can be very costly as well. But what do states gain from these arrangements if not direct military support? Well, we think that there's a few things. We think that it can be applying joint psychological political pressure to third states, obtaining political support in international institutions, certainly augmenting military capabilities, achieving these goals without entangling themselves into potential conflicts through alliance security assurances. This can also be like avoiding national or domestic politics that could be involved with joining alliances. Avoid dependence on powerful partners by spreading their bet through multiple partnerships, and to tie potential adversaries into relations of engagement and iterative action. So there's a lot of benefits that could be involved in joining these kinds of partnerships. I don't think anybody denies that, but what about these technology partnerships in particular that we're talking about? So really a subset of the broader strategic partnerships. Well, we see a rise in these strategic technology partnerships that are aimed at sharing the development of these EDTs that I mentioned. So some of these are non-military or industrial, such as 5G and many quantum technology initiatives. We see more in the civilian space than in the military space. But we also see many military or strategic with a focus on specific technologies. And we see a lot of partnerships around developing these kinds of technologies like fighter aircrafts, hypersonic missiles, drones, or cyber capabilities. But we're focused specifically on AI partnerships because of the substantial financial and political capital that goes into military AI development, but also because of its much anticipated impacts on the military and future battlefields that experts continuously espouse for AI. But there's a few goals that I think these partnerships or these MASPs can really serve for their contributing partners that are important to just highlight here. So strategic partnerships can certainly speed up the development of military AI capabilities among their partners. And in terms of joining a strategic partnership, it might take certain political capital or political commitment and military commitment to joining these types of partnerships, which may then prioritize the development of the technology itself. So this could speed up the development of capabilities we're seeing. Ensuring the interoperability of military systems with infrastructures and operational practices. So that refers to having systems that are integrated or able to be integrated and work together, which is really necessary and important for any joint or multinational operations or efforts in the future. They also could require partners to agree upon shared practices, which can be a difficult thing to do in the military. There's so many national incentives and national considerations that agreeing on shared practices can be challenging. So these partnerships can kind of facilitate that dialogue and discussion. And certainly sharing in-theater data for training, testing, and or improving AI systems is an incredibly important component of the partnerships as well. And eventually joint operations where AI systems are enable fully integrated digital information and military ecosystem to streamline necessary processes like command and control and communications. So we think that each one of these kind of represents an important area or component or goal where these partnerships can prompt partners to really move forward on each of these challenges here. But what does it look like? So what would this actually look like in practice? Well, we think that in order to fulfill these goals, there are certain activities and policy tools that could do just that, such as the pooling of resources for AI-enabled capability development, policy alignment on military AI, shared TEVV pipelines, that's testing, evaluation, validation, and verification, an important part of the process. Shared research and development programs or competitions, personnel exchanges, data sharing infrastructures or establishing joint data sharing infrastructures, and certainly standardization. So Zoe Stanley-Lockman has done quite a bit of work on this if you're interested in this, and she wrote a report called the Military AI Cooperation Toolbox, which has a really useful sets of policy tools for states to encourage this kind of cooperation that we're talking about here. But Zoe's work and her really fantastic report that was written for Georgetown's CSET series it doesn't zoom out to take in the bigger picture of strategic partnerships and maybe the broader implications of these partnerships that we see developing around military AI. So really, I think this paper that we're writing really kind of complements Zoe's more practical, hands-on cooperation toolbox here. So how could military AI strategic partnerships, which I know is a mouthful, but be different from other kinds of strategic partnerships? Well, we think that there are a few things that are unique to this particular kind of a relationship that we just want to point out here. So we believe that these MASPs may be operationally distinct from other kinds of technological partnerships. This imposes challenges that may be different from those that are encountered in other strategic technology partnerships. So such as there's sharing of more sensitive or classified data, high volume and high frequency of data sharing, demanding tight interoperability in military infrastructures, questions of transparency or explainability around programs and products, distinct expertise or human resource needs that are not necessarily the kind of what the military traditionally recruits or hires or looks for, and risks different and at times novel failure modes that could compromise multi-partner operations involving AI, requiring distinct TEVB procedures. So each one of these things here, and this is very likely not an exhaustive list either, but each one of these things listed here really represents a significant challenge for militaries for the future. And establishing these kinds of strategic partnerships is one way to begin to overcome and find resolutions to each of these challenges, rather than having just a national solution for each one of these bullet points, which could then become problematic in any kind of coalition or joint context. So, and I should just also mention that for each one of these bullet points, there is a very vast literature written about the challenges of each of these. So if you are interested, there is plenty more to find about the AI talent gap or the explainability and transparency and how the military needs to be able to overcome some of these challenges as AI continues to become more implemented into future scenarios and operations. So, okay, we've talked a lot about strategic partnerships, what they are, why states would want to engage with them, and what they can accomplish. But let's see some in action and what they really look like in practice. So there's 4 in particular that we've chosen here, and they really vary in terms of their geographic and dyadic diversity. There's differences in their formality or explicit collaboration here. And the first 2 that we'll look at, the Partnership for Defense and AUKUS, are really the more formal of the 4, as we will see. And the second 2, Russia, China, and the transatlantic collaboration, are really kind of more loose forms of cooperation. And there are big differences on both sides, but we argue that regardless of these differences, all 4 of them still represent strategic partnerships around AI. And it's important that we recognize that despite the differences, we need to think about them as a strategic partnership in order to capture their impacts moving forward and how AI is implemented into future military operations. So let's talk about the AI Partnership for Defense, or the PFD. So this is a US-led effort to promote collaboration on defense AI among like-minded allies. And it's quite new. It was established in 2020 with 13 founding nations, you can see here, with quite geographic diversity. And then in May 2021, it expanded to 16 nations, adding Germany, the Netherlands, and Singapore. The goal of this partnership is to create new frameworks and tools for data sharing, cooperative development, and strengthened interoperability. all things that we would expect and we kind of had listed in those potential goals for strategic partnerships. Importantly, the PFD points out that it is not there for co-development and rather aims for partners to be AI ready to enhance later interoperability. We can talk about this a little bit more in the discussion if you'd like, because I'm quite skeptical personally on how that's going to be possible. Or how likely that really is. I think there is going to be, links or connections probably of co-development here in order that are necessary in order to achieve that enhanced interoperability. But we can talk about that more in the discussion if you'd like. But there are a lot of uncertainties over the future direction of the PFD, also because there is such limited public information about this. And it's been really quite slow in getting going here. That could be because of COVID really maybe derailed a lot of the goals here, but it's been a pretty slow moving process so far. But some of the strengths that we can see here is that it operates outside pre-existing partnerships. So if you look at the countries that are part of the PFD, you might notice a lot of these are NATO countries, a lot of these are countries that have other areas where they are overlapping in its membership, even around AI specifically. The PFD could offer one alternative for working outside the pre-established partnerships that are already there. But we'll see as time goes on. There's also selected technologically advanced members that are a part of it, which is a key, I think, to being in the PFD itself. But there are key hurdles here. There are technical, political, and legal barriers between the PFD partners that could hinder these goals of enhanced interoperability. I don't think it takes too long looking at this list of membership either to see that there are already some pretty big differences among them. The most obvious and kind of easiest example is the weaponization of AI when it comes to autonomous weapons systems. Some of the members of this PFD are on very opposite ends of where they would like to, of how they think the weaponization of AI should move forward, or if there's any place for autonomous weapon systems on future battlefields. So I think they're going to run up against some of these barriers that exist among the partners. Additionally, even though I said it was a strength, I think it's also a hurdle that there is a risk of undercutting existing institutions, such as NATO, maybe most obviously NATO. And the PFD could risk becoming redundant next to some of these institutions like NATO or the Five Eyes, if those other existing institutions were to move very quickly and start adopting significant data sharing initiatives. Or alternatively, the PFD could end up functioning as like a competitor to NATO in some of these efforts. The relationship between the PFD and NATO still remains to be seen. As I said, it's been a kind of slow moving process. I think the most obvious strength of the PFD partnership in particular is that it includes Japan and Korea, bringing the Pacific really into many of these efforts and discussions, which many other existing partnerships do not. So the geographic diversity, I think, is really the strength of the PFD that we see here. As I said, it's a new institution. There is still much to be seen as it moves forward, but I do think it's something to pay close attention to in the future. So next we have the AUKUS agreement. If we can all remember when the news was dominated with this submarine deal between Australia, the US, and UK, which was established in September of 2021. So the goal of this particular partnership is to deepen information and technology sharing, to strengthen the integration of defense-related science and technology, industrial bases and supply chains, and deepen cooperation on several security and defense capabilities. So as I said, the main feature of this agreement and why it was in the news is because of these nuclear submarines that would be going to Australia. And there was a major political kind of fiasco with France, who was originally supposed to provide these submarines for Australia. And then they kind of bypassed France and decided to work with the US and UK instead. To me, that was not the most exciting part of AUKUS, because it's not only about submarines. There is a agreement to share critical information and data regarding military AI and quantum technologies. And just a few weeks ago, in their kind of 6-month update, they announced that they would be creating underwater robotics autonomous systems to begin trials and experimentation next year. And in the military space, that is like lightning speed. That's very, very fast for an autonomous system to begin really moving forward within a partnership like this. It's usually procurement and testing and experimentation usually is much slower than that. So it's a pretty significant development. Of course, as I will continue to say, the future direction is unclear because it is such early days of thinking about this. And it does have its challenges, right? The bilateral discord with pre-existing allies, namely France. It operates outside the long-established Five Eyes Alliance. And if you don't know what the Five Eyes Alliance is, it's an intelligence sharing partnership and network between Australia, the US, UK, Canada, and New Zealand. I think that once AUKUS was announced, it raised some eyebrows among experts of why New Zealand and Canada were not included in this agreement. So only 3 of the 5 were ended up as members here. But we can talk about theories of that in the discussion if you'd like as well. And there were some rifts or some confusion perhaps over the final membership selection, namely why Japan wasn't included. One of the explicit stated goals of AUKUS here was to increase this technological presence in the Pacific. And so with Australia, but it was a bit unclear to others why Japan didn't make the final cut as a member. However, that being said, AUKUS has been very explicit about wanting to work very closely and deeply with Japan in the future, and Japan has been very receptive to that. So I think they will have a close working relationship, but Japan is not an official member of AUKUS here. So AUKUS really represents, I think, the most formal agreement of all of the partnerships we're going to talk about here. But in terms of its scope and membership, and we know exactly kind of what the point of it is and what it's going to do. And they've been moving quite fast, given that it's a very new partnership. So we'll see where it continues to go. So next, let's talk about China and Russia and their scientific and technology, science and technology collaboration. Before I get into the details here, I think that it's just worth noting that in light of the conflict in Ukraine, the future of this collaboration really remains in question here. We can talk about this in the discussion, and I'm sure that we will. And in fact, after the hostilities began in February, China came forward and called Russia in explicit terms its strategic partner. But the full extent of how this conflict is going to impact the technological aspect or technical aspect of this strategic partnership, especially for military capabilities, really remains to be seen. We can certainly discuss it later, but there's no kind of concrete answers on how this is going to impact any AI collaboration moving forward. But let's just start with what's already happened. So a 2015 official Chinese visit to Moscow created new agreements on the digital economic cooperation. And until 2021, we see years of Russian-Chinese scientific, technological, and innovation cooperation, mostly in the civilian and economic space. And there's been quite diverse avenues for this collaboration. So it's existed through dialogues and exchanges, joint investment funds, the development of industrial science, and technology parks, joint science competitions, and an expanded academic cooperation. And many of these programs, the focus has been, or there has been a high focus on Chinese support for Russian military robotics, which is where Russian military AI investment has largely focused so far. So for the states that have invested heavily in military AI, they have kind of niche capabilities that they've focused on. So China has been focused on swarming and drone swarms quite heavily, and Russia has focused on robotics quite heavily. Now, there are hurdles, to be sure, that go beyond even just what's happening in current events. More specifically, the focus is still on just underlying research, and collaboration does not yet really extend to like data infrastructures or TEVV procedures. So kind of the next step in a true scientific collaboration in the military sense anyway. And there's ongoing concerns over copying or IP theft that are at play here as well. But on a larger scale, there are important things that China and Russia can offer each other in terms of complementary areas of expertise. As some experts have noted, China has relied on imports from Russia to bolster its air combat, air defense, anti-ship, and anti-submarine capabilities. And Russia has more extensive operational military experience, most recently in Ukraine and Syria, whereas China's military is still largely untested in some of these areas. So as I said, we can talk more about this in the discussion. I'm happy to, and I know Matthias is as well, about how this current conflict may affect the assessment or the future of this partnership. But much of it is just going to be kind of speculation because it really remains to be seen how the AI collaboration will evolve in the future. So finally, our last example here, we look at the seemingly lost transatlantic military AI strategic partnership. There are important discrepancies between European and mostly American goals regarding military AI. The European perspective on AI-enabled defense capabilities are subject to focus on just more incremental AI capabilities. There is huge intra-European military AI research divides. So 90% of the defense research and development in Europe comes from only 7 of the 27 EU member states. This is ripe for a capabilities or research gap potentially for the EU. And there are disparate political and strategic approaches to military AI, for example, between France and Germany. So, and although not part of the EU, but still European, and we should just maybe note that it does not really include the UK, which has had rather substantial cooperation with the US on military AI. But in terms of the EU, direct EU and US joint defense-related AI efforts do continue to remain rare. However, the EU has many frameworks and the policy infrastructure for a military AI partnership to emerge. So for example, in 2017, there's the establishment of the European Defence Fund and the Permanent Structured Cooperation, or the PESCO system, to bolster its strategic autonomy, and there's significant R&D funding compared to European defense. It's also the European Defence Agency has established a common definition and action plan for AI. We also see the EU inviting the US to participate in its first PESCO project, although it was not on an AI project specifically, but we are seeing steps towards kind of more policy collaboration and an infrastructure being built for that collaboration. But there are important advantages for this iteration of collaboration. A transatlantic military AI partnership could be significant in setting standards around responsible and ethical uses of military AI among crucial military partners. And if you'd like, we can talk about if maybe instead of a transatlantic collaboration, we're instead seeing collaboration through NATO or something. So if we have an existing institution like NATO, why would we see a specific EU-US partnership emerge? but I think that there are probably differences in a NATO context versus a EU-US context. So we can talk about that more, but I think the important thing to see here is that so far there has been the kind of extensive military AI partnership that we would see or expect to see perhaps between the US and EU. So before I wrap up and let you guys finally have the floor, let me just zoom out again to kind of the big picture here, now that we've seen some specific examples of what Matthias and I are really talking about. We want to explore this new and notable trend in technology and geopolitics, this growing role of strategic partnerships around the development and use of AI technology in a military context. But as I mentioned, this landscape is steadily evolving, and it's shifting as political, legal, and ethical considerations shape that implementation and future military practice. Simply put, there remains a lot of uncertainty here about these partnerships, but they will likely matter to the future implementation of military AI and require close attention and study. Many of the 4 partnerships discussed are still in their infancy, and the scope of their implications and potential are still being written. Nevertheless, it will be a key area of development for those that are hoping to study or shape the next chapter in this complex relationship between technology, security, and international relations. So I'll stop there, and Matthias and I are looking forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. We all learned a lot today about military AI. I suppose there are questions also particularly from our students who are in the audience. So if you could put them in the chat box, I'll just read them out loud. But also feel free to unmute yourself and ask. It usually takes us a while to get the questions ready, warm up a little bit during the Q&A. So I tend to take the moderator privilege and ask my questions first, while our students and our faculty who are in the audience to ask their questions. And thank you, Matthias, also for all the additional references that you shared with us. I clicked on them all, and we'll read them after the seminar. So my question, I mean, what I had in mind, which is something also in a way related to our work in our Initiate Digital Rights and Society initiative, is what this actually means also for the Global South. Because speaking of all the actors, the only country that at least we could say in a way belonging to the Global South, and that's also something we can debate, of course, is China, and to a certain extent Russia, when it comes to military AI and partnerships. Whether the Global South in this context is the question I had in mind, and what this means, these partnerships for the region. Again, it's a very general, of course, a blanket kind of view maybe, but to speak about the convergences and divergences in the Global South, it's a very general term we use for the region. But if you had any ideas about what it would mean, that'd be great. I'll pause.
It's a fantastic question, Mary. Thank you. I think that I think that I have to put some more thought into this. So maybe I'll send you a much more detailed email with an answer to your question. But my initial thoughts here is that if you look at the membership of some of these partners here, it can be kind of puzzling of who makes the cut and who doesn't, because there's also a big question of why India is not a part of the Partnership for Defense. Given its advanced technologically, it's deeply involved in many of these discussions, but it's still not a final member, and many experts are very confused of why that is exactly. So I don't know that there is a clear reason for why many more members of the Global South are not a part of the memberships themselves. But in terms of what do the partnerships mean for the Global South, I think that unfortunately it means that there's not nearly as much representation as there should be, that there is not nearly as much of a voice for the interests or incentives for states that are in the global South as opposed to the North. I think it's a huge oversight or area where there needs to be it needs to be rectified, because I think that there are specific interests that are going to go overlooked here, which is very likely. So I think it's an important, really important observation. I'm sure it's one that has been considered right at these kind of top level discussions, or I would hope, maybe I'm really giving everybody the benefit of the doubt here, but I think that as these partnerships continue to develop, maybe gain some more traction and better define their scope, because even the Partnership for Defense, as I mentioned, is kind of on the more formal scale of these partnerships. There's still a lot of room that needs to be explained, defined, scoped out. So there's really a lot of room here for them to grow, and hopefully to incorporate more of these interests and perspectives from the Global South. So I think it's a great point, and a huge oversight so far, but hopefully that will be changed. Don't know if you have anything to add, Matthias.
Yeah, I think I would mostly echo all of that. I think two sort of small sort of side points is that I would indeed be particularly interested to see, because like a lot of the major collaborative strategic partnerships that we have canvassed and studied and sort of seen are between global North states or and sort of a number of like sort of great power actors. Although in the case of these sort of EU and US collaboration, it's sort of notably at least somewhat absent so far. So it's also interesting to see. I guess in part, I think it'd be interesting that a number of global South actors have been somewhat more focused on sort of the processes for like regulating and stopping the demilitarization of AI. So including Eugenio Garcia had a good review on basically the role and the opportunities for shaping these UN CCW discussions around the regulation of autonomous weapon systems and things like that. I guess one interesting sort of fracture point in that in the coming years is to see whether, because there's obviously a wide range of AI systems that could be used in military roles, and not just sort of autonomous weapon systems, but also smart logistics, cyber warfare, and you name it. And so it will be particularly interesting to see to what extent global South actors will either expand the scope of opposition to the militarization of AI, so expand the scope from just aiming to restrain killer robots to also opposing other types of weapon systems, or alternatively, if they will develop their own types of collaborations on a range of AI systems. So one type of collaboration I would not be very surprised to see if there is further work or like collaboration between the US and India, given that they have been working on things such as unmanned aerial vehicles. I think it will be interesting to see what will be the role of, or the effect of if different global South actors either enter into their own strategic partnerships with actors like the US, or if they even try to sort of counterbalance by developing their own sort of counterbalancing strategic partnerships aimed at particular types of applications of machine learning, especially given that a lot of this is sort of proliferating quite quickly, and the deployment thresholds are getting lower quite rapidly. But it's definitely something for us to like think about in working this paper out further.
Thank you very much. I mean, there is another question that I actually wanted to ask, which is not necessarily about the paper you presented to us, but more about um, the discipline itself. Because I mean, as we're co-hosting the event with the IR department and with the AI and CSS seminar series, which is really revealing how interdisciplinary the actually work is, in a way speaking to multiple disciplines, not only in social sciences. It brings together law, international relations, political science, and well, economics in a way, as well as computer science and all. The question I had in mind was, how difficult is it to write about this topic, which is really actually requiring, in a way, different expertise, people from different fields who are not necessarily always speaking to one another naturally. That's the question I had in mind. It's a really emerging field in international relations, but particularly for students who are interested in interdisciplinary work, that would be actually great to hear a little bit more on that.
That's a fantastic question. I think what we're seeing, if you look at a lot of the military, I think this is especially true for military AI research, but you could choose your focal point really to be anywhere, is that it's really naturally now bringing in these multiple disciplines together, because I think the discipline is evolving to recognize that you have to include these different perspectives if you want to offer any kind of significant contribution here. And I have a theory of why that could be. I think it's partly because we're seeing the forefront of this research not necessarily coming from academics anymore. I think that a lot of it is coming from think tanks that have significant resources to tackle very interesting research projects that are much more practical, that are much more focused on tackling kind of the real world solutions. And so it's a little bit less of coming from like an IR department where people may naturally take a very specific IR perspective to a problem. So I think we're seeing a proliferation of who's doing this research, and at least in the military AI space, I would actually say in many ways it's the think tanks that are leading the way and paving the way for many of the academics researching this. So, and I think that we're starting to see even more collaboration between folks that are sitting in an IR department and working with think tank researchers instead. Even my own center is sort of a hybrid, research center where half of what we do is policy research and policy work, and half of what we do is academic work. So this blending in terms of like what the priority is for research is really changing. And I think that's actually just naturally allowed for more interdisciplinary perspectives and for more considerations to enter into the discussion and research agenda. And I think it leads to much more interesting work personally, but that's also because I think I very naturally fall at an intersection of international law and international relations, but and security and technology. So it's kind of a weird fusion of all of these disciplines. But I think that that's how it's evolving for most people, and I think that it's leading to really fascinating work and some change, even some maybe disciplinary changes or changes on a disciplinary level of how we think about technology and international relations, and certainly the future of military operations. So that's what I think. It's a good observation, though.
And I think also for my part, I would sort of recommend students that they, really quite dive into this. I think one interesting thing about the field that I found, also when I started out in it and just doing a PhD, is that because it's such a new field, there is a lot more sort of novel links that even as a fairly junior researcher or scholar or student, that you're able to identify and draw, where perhaps it's just a series of conceptual lenses that people in the AI field just haven't sort of thought about and that you're able to draw on. So some of the early work I did in the space was drawing on the sort of lens of organizational theory and sort of like normal accident theory. And that, I'm not saying that was like the best treatment or the best application necessarily, but it can very quickly be a perspective that you can draw and sort of apply and sort of and show the implications of that some existing disciplines just wouldn't have necessarily thought of. And so it's it's a very fertile time to sort of start out into this field and to highlight what other disciplines are missing out, or at least, and not to say that like we should always then, I mean, at some point it would be good to develop a new sort of research community or paradigm that is able to like have a shared sense of what the research problems are and how to approach them. But I think right now it's good to err on the side of sharing many of these reasons, or erring on the side of, okay, sometimes it's confusing or hard to like talk across these disciplines, but it's still quite useful and quite urgent and relevant right now. I think there are many, luckily there are also a number of sort of journals or institutions or different venues that are quite keen and interested in people exploring these topics, even if it sort of edges outside of the conventional disciplinary boundaries, at least I found.
Thank you very much. Now, leaving aside my moderator privileges, I will read the questions from the chat box. Speaking of the interdisciplinarity, we have a question from Dr. Pininangan, who happens to be a computer engineer from Middle East Technical University. So she's asking, people were thinking wars would be all cyber in this century, but we have seen an example of a non-cyber war in the case of Ukraine. I guess that's a popular question you get nowadays. Are there any AI elements in this war?
Yeah, it's an incredibly important question. And I think it's something that's taken some experts by surprise here in terms of the it not being a cyber war, although I think it's important to also acknowledge that there has been quite significant cyber attacks as part of this war, but it has not been particularly public, and it's been and I think that it's been that Ukraine has received significant resources in terms of cyber defense for this conflict, and that has been pretty instrumental for it maybe not becoming a cyber war. But I think that in terms of AI, many of the initial responses to this conflict in Ukraine was that all of the new technology discussion has been overhyped, clearly, because this war has been more conventional on the ground kind of resources. But I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. I think that there's elements of that, but actually there's also been significant drone use in this conflict as well, and some of these drones that are being used, I don't have them, I think it was the Lancet and a few others, it's that have autonomous functions, capabilities that can be used in a fully autonomous way. It's been unclear if they have been used in their autonomous functions in this conflict. They're being used on both sides by both Ukraine and Russia. But of course, this kind of information is just not going to be available right now. So I think that there's been some observers have realized that AI has been part of the discussion. It's certainly not forefront and kind of dominating the discussion, but it has been there, and I think that it's raised some questions about how future conflicts may kind of continue to incorporate these autonomous systems, or systems that have autonomous functions to them, and what that will mean in the future. So it's there. There is AI, I think, is part of the discussion. I don't think it's the dominant discussion, but we'll kind of see what continues. I know I don't know if maybe somebody else remembers this, and I should know this because I'm presenting this today, but Russia had announced something recently. I don't know if you recall this, Matthias, or not, about AI and its like kind of next step of its AI capabilities, or wanting to invest in this one particular AI capability. I can't recall exactly what it is, but regardless, I think it just signals or illustrates that at least for Russia, AI is not off of the agenda, and it's certainly part of their thinking moving forward, whether it's going to be used in the immediate future or not. But it's something that certainly they are considering for the future. So so that's what I would say. I don't know if you have anything to add, Matthias.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point because it gets to the discussion that for any technology that we want to talk about, there's sort of like 4 layers of like how big of a deal is it? And the first layer is something like sort of like state rhetoric. So like how much are they putting their like hopes on something like cyber is the next big thing, and then like how much are they talking about that? Second is like investment. So how much are they actually backing that up by meaningful like research and investment? Thirdly is like sort of deployment. Is it actually seeing deployment widespread in wars, or is it just something that like they invested a ton in and then it never was quite useful or like a relevant capability on the battlefield? And fourthly is the impact. Is sort of like how disruptive is the impact actually? And there may be cases, and this is a very tricky thing to assess with technologies ex ante, because there may be technologies that sort of have gone under the radar for a long time and then end up being hugely disruptive in the battlefield. So in the 2000s, no country was no countries having like a state, oh, we're going to massively invest in improvised explosive devices because they're the technology of the future. They still had a big impact on coalition operations in Iraq and elsewhere. Otherwise, likewise, you've got some technologies that are have a lot of sort of buzz around them, a lot of investment, and their ultimate sort of impact in the battlefield may be more limited than I sort of predicted, at least in the short run, but may end up being quite large in the long run, or just like, yeah, different than what people imagined it would look like. So cyber war hasn't played out in the sense of, oh, we're crashing we're causing nuclear power plant meltdowns, but it has worked out in the sense of like, oh, cyber disinformation and information campaigns. And so I'm very interested in the general question of these 4 layers. When in advance can we tell, yeah, which of these technologies that is sort of made front and center for strategy or partnership actually ends up being strategically disruptive or not? When are we overestimating the ultimate impact, or when are we underestimating that also? And I think that's a relevant. It would be good if we could learn from like our past performance in which technologies you got right or not. Yeah.
I think I would also just add to this maybe that it's not only Russia and Ukraine who could be learning lessons here, but I think that we're also seeing NATO really considering its innovation agenda and its and how AI and quantum and all of these other EDTs that are in its portfolio moving forward are going to be significant, and it being an area where NATO is going to want to prioritize its capabilities. And so I think that in June, when NATO has its Madrid conference for this new strategic concept, I think it's called, we don't know, of course, what's going to be on it, but I would be surprised if innovation and emerging technology are not quite high on NATO's agenda after this conflict.
Thank you very much. There is actually a question in a way related to that from Batuhan Jandar, who happens to be a researcher in our lab. Thank you for the presentation. It was really helpful to learn. And I have a question about your opinion. He says, do you think that such partnerships show the non-comprehensiveness and the changed trust parameters of the NATO? We see that the non-NATO members all around the world in the partnership with high AI capabilities. However, most of the NATO members are not in by thinking the applications of AI in autonomous weapons. What is your opinion? Is that clear, or would you like to have a clarification to the question.
I think, I think I understand the question that I think that there is a significant capability gap, and autonomous weapons, I think, are like a kind of unique subset of this whole discussion that we're having, because I think there is massive mobilization around autonomous weapons, and much of my research actually focuses on autonomous weapons. So it's something I kind of run into a lot in my research and looking at this, that for many states in NATO, outside of NATO, there are hard lines of we are not even going to kind of entertain the idea of having autonomous weapons, killer robots, if you want to call them that, on the battlefield. And then you have, kind of the other side where, despite this effort, and often it's not just states, but also civil society that is mobilized quite heavily in trying to ban this kind of capability. But regardless of the efforts to do that, or to have a treaty that is banning such capabilities, it has not convinced the most powerful states not to invest and try to acquire some of these capabilities. So I think, in my opinion, that autonomous weapons are something that I think is going to continue. That it's unlikely to see a treaty that's going to ban this kind of capability, because it's too significant. But I think for NATO specifically, this is going to be a challenge for NATO, because NATO partners, many of them, Germany, I'm thinking of specifically, that is one of those hard liners, and Germany is a very significant partner in NATO. And despite, we are seeing major shifts in German policy as a result of this Russia-Ukraine conflict. But I don't see them kind of backpedaling on autonomous weapons, and because they've just been so strong on it in the past. So I think that, to me, these alternative partnerships that we see emerging might be other mechanisms or other avenues for developing or pursuing capabilities that maybe are just going to meet too much resistance in NATO. So it's, but, I think that NATO has a lot to offer in terms of standardizing military AI and kind of formulating some sort of operational principles around its use, and it's going to be critical moving forward. But the weapons discussion is a really tricky and delicate one for NATO. So I think that I think these partnerships are an important tool for states that do want to pursue those kinds of avenues, to find new ways to do so outside of NATO or other existing legacy partnerships.
Did you want to add anything, Matthias, to what Lena said, or?
No, yeah, and I think that's mostly, Lena offers very complete answers, so I think I'm fine for that also.
Thank you very much. So, as we're approaching actually the end of the seminar, we usually try to allocate an hour plus 15 minutes. I, again, would like to open the floor for any questions, but if not, if you would like to ask questions after the seminar, I guess I can invite everyone to email Dr. Mas and Terbuco, for those who are a little shy to put their questions here. And also, of course, thank you both so very much for sparing time for us today. It was a fantastic talk, and we all enjoyed it very much. And I turn to you, of course, for any final remarks, anything you would like to add.
I think I just want to thank you for the invitation and to come and to talk about some of this work. I'm also going to take maybe not being bombarded with questions as it being a very clear, and there's just and convincing which is very helpful for me moving forward. But thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really disappointed it had to be on Zoom. Hopefully one day in the future it can be in person and we can travel to Istanbul and chat in person. So
exactly. So this was actually originally planned to be an in-person and hybrid seminar, but we hope to host you very soon in Istanbul.
Thanks a lot.
With that, I'll pause recording